Thank you everyone for joining us today. To my three panelists, because we want to get right into the discussion, you are three internationally recognized experts. I want to get right into our talk today about is the future still green? Europe's strengths and weaknesses in sustainable energy supply. And I have to say this is a really gorgeous place to be able to hold this plenary table today. I want to map out for everyone a little bit how our panel is going to proceed. We will have right around 50 minutes for our discussion today. We're going to look at Europe's sustainable energy, and we're going to have the opportunity to talk about some, but maybe not all of the following: electricity, batteries, the grid, electric vehicles, building stock, tariffs, competition, and innovation. Part of that fifth pillar that we heard about earlier today during the keynote. And while I have a lot of questions prepared, and I'm sure the audience as well, is a lot more interested in what the three of you have to say than about anything that I might say. So if you hear your fellow panelists make a point, and you want to agree with it, or you want to disagree with it, or you want to add something onto that, just give me a little sign, and my eyes are going to be on you almost the whole time, and I'll pick you up and let you have the discussion. I thought the discussion right before this one was quite exciting. I'm the least interesting person on this stage, so let's get started. And I want to do so. I know we have lots of experts in the field in lots of different areas here in the audience, but I'm going to set the stage a little bit when it comes to sustainable energy supply. So in the EU, the energy sector is responsible for more than 75%, so that's more than 3/4 of the EU's greenhouse gas emissions. There's been some good news recently. Half of public electricity generation in the EU came from renewables in the first half of this year. That's the first time that this happened. And here in Germany, just over half of electricity consumption was covered with renewables in that same time period. But it's not all good news. If you're following along the program, I'm taking a little bit of this from there. Europe is struggling to keep up in battery technology and related areas of green innovation, such as electric mobility. Germany, for an example, is 5 years behind its EV targets. And progress is held back by delayed investment, lack of innovation, and insufficient manufacturing capacity. And to add to that, the transformation of the energy system has created competitive disadvantages in energy prices, especially for German industry, and created dependencies and supply chain risks for raw materials such as lithium and rare earths. The question that we're going to try to answer today, or start to answer today, is if Europe wants to lead the green transition, how should it respond to these issues? I know that's a lot all at once. So we're going to start with our title, The Strengths and Weaknesses, and we're going to look right now, panelists, at the EU's weaknesses. Earlier in the keynote today, Enrico Letta noted that we need to integrate as one in Europe. We have 27 energy markets right now, so that can't be one of the weaknesses that we talk about. However, what are Europe's other biggest weaknesses when it comes to a sustainable energy supply? Only for now, I want you to limit your responses to about 2.5 minutes, but you're going to get more time later on. But just for right now, let's be kurz und knapp, and you're going to have more time later on in the session. Clare Grey, Cambridge University, I'd like to start with you. What are Europe's biggest weaknesses when it comes to sustainable energy supply?
So thank you very much. My mic's on, I think. So I've identified a few things, and hopefully we'll come back to them. I mean, I think the EU is interesting because we lie between two extremes, the US and China, one with less regulation, more money, more speculative money, particularly for early investments, and then one much more top-down with longer-term strategy. And so that's a challenge. We've talked about diverse, disconnected energy supplies, governed by different politics and geographies, and that we have to acknowledge this. We have lost our ability to manufacture, and I come from the UK, which is decided under Margaret Thatcher to be a service industry, and that's had significant impact. We talked about not having, or the transition to not having sort of connected academia, but I think it's more important that we've lost our know-how. And that know-how more is in how to do the manufacturing, the trained workers. And so I don't believe it's at the PhD level. And I personally believe we have innovation. We have decided that we want to, but we've decided we want to leapfrog, but we have not put the commitment in to do the leapfrogging. If we're going to leapfrog, that is sustained investment out from the lab into the marketplace. And it's not just that early investment. The biggest challenge is to get the consumers and do the manufacturing when you don't have that know-how. So that's talking about finance, valley of death, and I think that's my 2.5.
Yeah, fantastic. That's fine. Carry on, please.
So, I mean, again, I think we just need to reflect on how we do subsidies and where that comes from, and we have to think about how we make decisions on who the winners are, and we can talk, and what role government has, and I think that's something I'd like to come back to.
I want to come back to that topic as well, finances, subsidies, and as well as the role of government. But right now, I'd like to move on to Simon Müller. What are Europe's biggest weaknesses right now?
Well, I would say that, first of all, I think there is a tendency to misdiagnose what the problem currently is. If we look back at the past years of the energy system in Europe, we've had, at some point, really extreme energy prices, which was related to, and at some point, tenfold increase in the price of natural gas. And the echo of this fossil energy price crisis still resonates into also, in particular, the German industrial base. This is seen, depending on what kind of contracting structure you still have these higher energy prices on the books of the companies. And also, there are spillover effects into the electricity system. So one of the reasons why grid fees doubled on the transmission level in Germany was that there are very high gas prices behind this. And I think it's critically important to realize that a lot of the trouble that we're still in actually goes back to this rather than the transition to clean energy. Now, this is not to say that this transition comes without challenges. There's definitely challenges there as well. I think one issue that we do have is that the governance framework in Europe is more directed towards ensuring fair competition between the different member states rather than mobilizing massive investments at scale very, very quickly. And the principal bottleneck that we're seeing popping up in more and more European countries is the challenge to mobilize the necessary capital to go ahead with the clean energy transition. And this includes money for deployment, so deployment of these technologies, for grid infrastructure, and also for the manufacturing capacity of these technologies to get technological sovereignty on these critical future technologies. And I think resolving this issue and finding ways to unlock these investments is among the most critical challenges currently. And of course, the fact that we are in an environment of a more restrictive monetary policy and fiscal consolidation in many countries, I would say these are the main roadblocks that we currently see for a successful transition.
Thank you. We're going to come back and look at grids in a couple of questions. But for now, Nicolas Steinbacher, let's hear what you think the greatest weaknesses are right now.
I think a lot of right things have already been said. I would add that I think we're very good in the EU to build like a vision based on morale, ethics, and philosophy. But then it comes to the right strategy to execute, and this needs to hold beyond the next election, which we can see right now is the combustion engine phase out 33 like still right or not. So these discussions are not helping in the discussion of a transition because people want to invest in the future and know what's happening. So especially for companies. And then it's about having smart implementation. So I agree what you said. You need to do solid manufacturing. You need to train people in environments like battery manufacturing, which is really not easy because complex manufacturing parameters is completely new from automotive industry, for instance. And the other thing is that you need integration is a very big word, but a right word right now, but also sequencing in the right way. Building up enough renewable energy, then building something up which can store the energy for a use case, and then the use case is the electrification in terms of a battery storage system for the energy transition, but also for electric cars. And what maybe has not been right is the right strategies for sequencing that and understanding for what needs to be when in place and what needs to be subsidized when in order to have the most efficient system running. And I think managing these complex systems is something what gets more and more difficult in these times with populistic politicians acting and everybody looking in the vertical areas of their fields. So integration and managing complex systems is something what we lack right now.
Managing complex systems is definitely important. You know, I've thought about, and if you as panelists want to, we can talk about where populism fits in with this, although I think that might be, if we started talking about that right now, we wouldn't end this panel until tomorrow morning. But so I want to grab onto something that you were talking right now. I don't know if you have had a chance to read the bios in the program yet, but we have some incredible battery people up on stage. And so now I want to look at the next question, which was going to focus on batteries by way of something I read about in the Financial Times about 5 days ago. So the FT reported that, and I quote, "European power prices have fallen below zero for a record number of hours this year as the rapid development of solar and wind generation outpaces the continent's ability to deal with excess supply." Now, one of the reasons that this happens is that energy generators don't yet have the infrastructure to store that excess energy and end up paying consumers to use that excess energy. And while I'm a consumer, it's great if you're going to pay me to do my laundry or to watch a film, it's bad news for Europe's renewable energy projects. And one of the solutions to this issue of excess energy, obviously, is batteries. Obviously just one, but one of the important ones. So now, panelists, I want to come back at you with individualized questions for each of you to look at the following. Simon Müller, you look at electricity, heat, and energy infrastructure for Germany. You've also worked at the International Energy Agency, IEA, and you've advised governments of more than 20 countries on 6 continents. You were one of the authors on Agora Energiewende's 2023 Stand der Dinge. I don't have to translate for this audience, but that's like a state of affairs on the energy transition in Germany, which, among other topics, talked a little bit about the importance of energy storage. And I'm curious, where are we right now when it comes to an energy infrastructure state of affairs in Europe?
So first, it is, despite the fact, or let's put it this way, it's extremely good news that batteries have become so cheap. However, compared to other means of dealing with electricity, it still comes at quite an additional cost. So, especially for wind power, a very cost-effective strategy is a stronger interconnection. And that's immediately plausible. Think about a weather map of Europe that you sometimes see on TV, a film, and then you have these low-pressure areas running through, right? That's where the wind is. And so wind farms are nothing but like a catching mechanism for these. And the bigger your network is, the more likely it is that you have one of those systems within the area where you can catch. So that immediately makes plausible why this interconnection and links across countries make sense. Now, when it comes to storage, and we do have challenges with speeding up grid deployment. It's been one of the areas of, I would say, success in the current legislative term in Germany. 2023, as many power lines were permitted than in both previous years combined. And there's quite an acceleration in this area, but this isn't going fast enough. And we see that as a global issue, right? So the build out of infrastructure is hugely important. There are many ways, it's a little bit tricky to explain in simple terms, but essentially, with solar PV in particular, the value of electricity really depends on what moment we're talking about. Mm-hmm. So in the future, on a summer weekend, we can do all kinds of things with this electricity that don't really have to be that efficient. And when you build storage to capture this electricity, you have to make sure that it's actually used often enough so that it gets a business case. And we're at a very exciting moment right now in Europe because storage has become cheap enough to exactly do this lifting from the middle of the day to the shoulders of the day. And this is fantastic news, and it's very important for this to go ahead. And I think storage will also help in reconciling some of the bottlenecks that we have in terms of the grid. Now, every single storage that we build for the sole purpose of integrating renewables will increase the cost of the energy system. Every single bit of storage that we're building for different purposes and we can use, for example, the battery in an electric car, and we can use to integrate renewables, will actually increase the overall economic efficiency of the system. So we should really think about ways to also flexibilize the demand side and thinking of storage not just as electricity storage, but for example, in our newer scenarios, we have seasonal energy storage where you use that cheap PV electricity simply to heat water to 90 degrees in a huge tank or in an artificial lake. You put a little bit of a plastic cover over it, and you use it in winter. So there's many opportunities how you can store. We still need to build out the grid, and it still has to go faster. And it's still true that it's fantastic news that batteries are getting so cheap that we can use them more in order to do this shifting in the day.
Thanks so much, Simon. Nicolas, and I want to come to you next. Simon brought up grids. So you're working on the establishment of one of Northvolt's largest battery production facilities in the Heide region in Germany. Construction started in March of this year. And you've spoken elsewhere about batteries as an enabling technology and also as contributors to grid stability. I want to ask you first to explain what do you mean enabling technology, and then tell us what are the hurdles that are keeping us from using the full range of possibilities that batteries bring in terms of grid stability?
Yeah, so I think enabling technology means that the technology of batteries is like also like a semiconductor. You can put it in different kinds of use cases and then reach the real thing you want to do. Because batteries is not there because it's a battery, it's a great product. It's enabling other use cases like electric cars, which enable the decarbonization of the mobility sector. You are enabling battery storage systems to enable the grid leverage, which we just heard. And you can also do it into aviation, into first use cases and so on. So it's actually enabling use cases for decarbonization. And as you said, I think what we do with the gigafactory we want to build in Heide, Schleswig-Holstein, let me just take this as an example, is exactly that. Why have we chosen this location? Because the site is directly integrated into a big wind farm, actually. So you have a lot of windmills just around, and there's a lot of production in the region, which is currently a problem to the redispatch in Germany, where the grid providers need to pay extra money to shut down the windmills because there is no grid which can transport the electricity away. So you produce electricity with an EEG, which is not used for economic value, which is what I meant with that our systems are not vertically integrated. Mm-hmm. We do a lot of incentives programs like subsidies for batteries, subsidies for EEG and all these kind of things, but it's not in a system which is managed. So it's completely inefficient at a certain point of view. And what we try to do is kind of set this big consumption there in terms of a gigafactory to get the electricity where it actually is, and being also connected to one of the two big hubs which are being built in Germany on getting the offshore energy on land. So it makes a lot of sense to make this there. And then I think the last question you just need to repeat for me, sorry.
That's all right. What are some of the hurdles that still exist to keep us from using the full range of possibilities that batteries bring in terms of grid stability?
Yeah. So the thing is that we're always talking about general batteries, but there is no general battery. There is different chemistries and different purposes. There's batteries for electric cars in the premium segment. There's batteries for the mid and the entry segment. There's batteries for electric trucks. There's batteries for energy storage. So what we do is we try to design the battery in that way, like you design a semiconductor, to make the best out of it in the end for the use case. And the tricky thing is that you need to have specialized machinery, you need to have specialized processes for certain batteries, for certain chemistries. So it's not like that you have one recipe and you scale it up easily. And then you need to find the companies having the capital and the funding for doing these niches and being efficient in that, and then being competitive against the Asian market where the most cheap batteries getting produced. So, and this is maybe something I would also bring to the discussion, because it's not only about like the cost. Of course, it's great if we want to decarbonize, but you should also know that like 90%, 95% of the battery storages being built in Germany right now are stuck or are established with so-called LFP batteries, which is lithium iron phosphate batteries, which China controls 95% of the entire supply chain. So what we're actually doing right now is we're building these storages, but what we're actually doing is also a kind of dependency in the most important I would say hardware item in the German energy transition with Chinese technology.
I don't want to cut you off, but we're going to talk about that next, because that's, I think, one of the biggest issues that we have, because we're talking about sustainable energy supply in Europe. But first I want to go to Clare Grey, Cambridge University. You're involved in research that is really at the cutting edge of battery development. You won the Körber Prize in 2021. And your research has enabled significant improvements in the performance of lithium batteries. Now, you're in education, in academia. And in terms of the pipeline from research where you work to when I get to see it out on the streets of Hamburg or Berlin or anywhere, what's missing when it comes to framework conditions that speed up implementation?
Can I just quickly comment on the last point?
Absolutely.
Just to say, I agree with everything you're saying. One thing that people need to recognize about batteries is they're a business-to-business production. And so we depend, a battery depends very much on the consumer market. And just the Sony rocking chair battery came because Sony didn't care about a battery, they cared about their camcorder. And that has problems in developing models. And so current issues now, because of electric vehicles, the batteries plummet. And so it's a very different industry, so you have to recognize that aspect. And then when it comes to grid storage, there's always this tension between using a cheaper product and coming from somewhere else versus getting a new technology into the marketplace. And so I just use that to bring back now to being the academic. You know, we're academics. Anything we do in my lab, if we're lucky, will be for sale in 7 years' time, if everything goes to plan. And so we're always encouraged to leapfrog. But anything we do then, you have to then be competitive against an incumbent. And so when you've got lithium-ion batteries going down and down and down, how do you bring in a new technology? And so sitting from where I am in Cambridge, we're very lucky. We have an infrastructure of entrepreneurs and Cambridge Enterprise who are very good at encouraging students winning prizes, encouraging the entrepreneur spirit. And I think there was a session with the Max Planck previously saying that wasn't there. But I don't think that's something we suffer from. So, and that's lucky. So I think that sort of model hopefully can be replicated in other places in Europe. And there's also a fair amount of money for that early stage, taking it from the lab. If you have a good idea, it's actually not too difficult to find 1 or 2 million to get out. There are quite a few innovation funds in the UK and Germany and in Europe to do this. I think the next and if you're lucky, you can find the infrastructure around you with people who have experience with starting companies. The next challenge, really, I see it, is in manufacturing. So if you're a battery company, and I'm speaking from experience, so we have a small company that does fast charging, we need to build a battery to sell it to somebody, because we're not selling a product, we're selling a battery which will go into something. So we need to manufacture it. Where do you manufacture? So there are places in Europe where they have small pilot scales, but they're extremely expensive, and they can only be done with subsidies. And so you end up having to manufacture elsewhere, often in Asia. So I think it's that challenge, not of just from the lab to the initial startup. It's in the next stages. Is all along, how do we actually leapfrog, and how do we put that money in, and raising money not in the 1 million but in the 10, the 40, the 100s is often the challenge. So,
how do we leapfrog?
I think we just need to be, well, first of all, we need to start by being upfront and honest about this. So in the UK, we have a development bank that will fund things in the energy transition, but they will never go in, they will always be followers, they won't be leaders. So I think being critical and assessing where the pots of money should be. It's very difficult to pick winners. Governments don't feel they should be in a position to pick winners, and they shouldn't be. So I don't have the answers to these things, but I think as a community, as academics and business people, I think we need to confront that next stage. It's not just the early stage. And then, I'm going to stop for the moment on that. Those thoughts.
Simon, I wasn't sure if I saw you. Yeah, please.
Well, I think this is a very interesting point, because it connects the transition to a more sustainable energy supply and climate neutrality to some core beliefs about essentially the role of government. And I think this makes part of the transition really difficult because there is such a degree of uncertainty about certain technology trajectories that you have to have accumulated so much capital already in order to take a bet on this, to scale it. I mean, Tesla is an example of this. But this doesn't really work on a societal level, and I don't think we should rely on such a mechanism as a society. So I think there is actually, I wouldn't see good alternatives to governments really having a more proactive view and really going in, maybe not picking winners, but picking those who have the potential to succeed, and then really putting money into it and seeing whether it will work. I mean, the fact that we now have solar PV at the cost we have today is a very consistent support environment that was set up in Germany and kind of maintained despite the fact that it became quite expensive at some point, but really the technology delivered the cost reductions. And this is also something that makes it challenging because success then renders the ones that came first less economic. So the strongest competitor to today's electric vehicles are the electric vehicles of the future. And we see it in the retail value of used cars, right? So what mechanisms do we find to actually shield the first wave or the current wave that we need of technology from being undercut by the expectation of the future technology? And if you have a good example or a good solution that doesn't involve the government taking a lot of that risk, do tell me. I'd be super interested because I've thought deeply about this and I'm not finding particularly great alternatives.
A great offer from Simon Müller. If anyone has something, we have coffee in about a half an hour. You can also find him on LinkedIn. We can have a conversation there as well. But first I want to go, thank you for that. I want to move on to something else also because we have like 17 questions that we want to ask and we just don't have the time. So I want to come back to China. And we're going to look at competition innovation. We've talked a lot about reports today here, and I want to add another one. It's from the IEA, the International Energy Agency, in April. They said, and I'm going to slow down a lot because I think this is pretty stunning, battery manufacturing capacity has more than doubled in the last year, and it goes on to say that, quote, completing all announced projects would be enough to meet demand to 2030 on our net zero path. Which is kind of stunning, right? Like, we want to meet this goal, and if everything that we say is going to happen happens, we'll get there by 2030. But as you rightly pointed out, China dominates the battery supply chain right now. That same IEA report notes that China had nearly 85% of global battery cell production capacity last year. I know nothing about batteries. I don't know about you. I'm going to explain quickly what the battery cell means. So batteries can be made up a lot of different parts, and I'm so sorry to have to say this in front of such experts, but the battery cell, that's the bit that holds the energy, yeah? And critical minerals are also, highly concentrated geographically, as we've noted, and battery mineral prices have been volatile in recent years. We all know what happened when it came to Germany's and Europe's energy supply in 2022. When Russia invaded Ukraine. And we realized that relying on one source for something that's very important, energy, becomes problematic. Are we walking into the same issue with battery technology and China? Is this, I don't know, is this an opportunity to join forces, or what do we do?
Depends,
Nicolas?
I would say.
Okay,
just first, I would say, why is China so successful in this? Because they integrated their strategy from the very beginning. They had, like 15 years ago, they said, okay, we connect the battery industry with the electric car industry. Why do we need this? Because it's good for the society. We do not have any more smogs in our big cities. So if you're now in Shanghai, it's completely different years before. Why? Because there's more electric cars on the street. So it's good for society. And they were able, with also subsidies, for instance, like CATL, the biggest battery manufacturer in China, gets more subsidies than the oil companies in China, which is completely different in Europe, for instance, or the US. So you need to see the bigger system here. And what's also interesting is that in China, the electric vehicles are called NEVs. What does it mean? Not battery electric vehicle like us, BEVs, but it's new energy vehicles. So they think it from the upstream. They think it from renewable energy production, then the battery production, and then the car industry, which I meant when I said it's vertically integrated and sequenced in the right way. And that's what makes it so competitive, what they do, because it's following a long-term strategy. And not necessarily so that Europe can't do this too. We just need to, we all have the ingredients, but we're not lining it up in the right way. And that, I think, is a bit the thing right now. And we have the FNE, we have R&D, which is super in Europe, so that's not the problem. The problem becomes when we need to get the funding straight, we need to get the energy regulation straight, we need to get the manufacturing, as you said, straight, and then also have the mindset for scaling. It's like always in Europe that you think, okay, yeah, you have great research institutes and everybody's talking about the technology, but when it comes to the topic, okay, which entrepreneur is now investing and builds it up? Yeah, okay, then it's Elon Musk and some Chinese people from coming to build it in Europe. So that's also a little bit our problem here, that we are just too risk averse. And I like what you just said on the topic of subsidies a bit. That was making me think, because you could also think subsidies in this situation right now from governments as governmental venture capital. Because you need to bet on the future, you need to bet on a sustainable future if you really mean it, from what we say, from our moral and ethics and so on. And I think that is something what we need to be bold and just go away. And when everything comes together, I think I'm pretty sure we can do this. We have batteries in our portfolio which are very competitive in a premium segment, where customers say, yeah, it's better than Chinese. But we just need to get things lined up.
Mm-hmm. Simon, I think you wanted to.
Yes, I think something that is often underappreciated in this debate are also the strategic incentives that China has to move on this trajectory. I think it's now become somewhat of a political clarity that coal won't be the energy carrier that the country will continue to be based on. You see that most recently with stopping the permitting process of the most recent wave, or the majority of the most recent wave of coal plants. But then the question is, which other energy carriers can you actually access? And that brings LNG into the picture, and of course oil. And if you now look at this geopolitically, the United States are actually, globally, the major producer of these commodities, and many of the exporters, if you look at Australia, for example, would be also politically quite aligned. So when you look at it through the lens of geopolitics, all of a sudden it becomes very, very rational to build an energy system that does not have this sort of dependency. And so that gives a strategic clarity and a long-termism that allows to sustain a few years of, deficit in this area, overcapacity in this area. The reason that we see that this battery capacity is sufficient to meet the 2030 net zero energy target of the IEA by 2030 shows that there's a different strategic expectation behind what China is doing. And I think until and unless we realize that and fully appreciate what this tells us also about the direction of travel for the energy system here in Europe, we won't be able to draw the same strategic conclusions, and rather go and try to secure long-term agreements for LNG that are way longer in terms of the tenure than what we probably need. I mean, don't get me wrong, energy security is critical, but if you run and get a 20-year LNG agreement, it's not going to be Europe in 10, 15 years from now benefiting from this, because the strategic opportunities are somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Clare Grey, I see you nodding, and so I want to offer you an opportunity to respond.
No, I don't actually need to respond. I mean, I think the government, the only thing we haven't talked about in terms of government roles is to also be customers, to be the ones getting the contracts for ports, for charging infrastructures, and so providing different mechanisms for bringing companies through. So that's be another point. But I think the points about strategy and long-termism in China is such a critical one, and I think we need to address it. And the UK has just changed its administration. Many other countries in Europe have, and that needs to be stressed. And I've done some work for the Royal Society where we assessed battery strategies across different countries across the world, and Asia, most Asian countries, it's not just China, it's also Japan, it's also Korea, have had strategies that are much longer term. And one of my colleagues in Beijing, I asked him, he runs the sodium-ion battery technology, and he said, so China is trying to look at sodium for the next generation, cheaper systems, and he said, I'm setting up this little institute to take the research from the lab to industry. And so it's just a small little institute to think about that within China. And I said, well, how small is small? He said, oh, we've only got about 400 people working on it. So, you know, it's just, we need strategies, but we also need people, and we need, anyway, and long-termism. You know, needing people is unfortunately one of the topics that we didn't get a chance to cover today, but it is a critical one. Who's going to do this? Before we open to questions from the audience, I want to come back to the title of our plenary session, which was Strengths and Weaknesses, and look about strengths. So thinking in the EU. I think this is also important. According to the World Economic Forum's 2024 findings, the top 10 countries that are fostering an effective energy transition are in Europe. Germany is number 11 on that list. Europe is still leading the green transition. So, panelists, who's doing it right? Who has the strengths right now? And what can we learn from them across, you know, we heard today about 27 different energy models. Who's doing it right that we can make this 28th? Nicolas, I'll start with you.
You mean which country is doing it right, or?
Which country, which researcher, which business, which company, which startup? Who's doing it right? And if you have 0 European examples, tell me who in the world is doing it right.
It's actually a challenging question. I think the innovation is something what I think in every European country there is better ones, and of course ones which are not that good. But I think innovation is something what we can do very well in R&D. So we should build on this. We should also build on what we are also connecting here in Europe on this collaboration. And there is a lot of collaboration in the research sector, but also in the industry, which you can use. And the diversity on what Europe has to offer is also something what I think is a very big asset, but it's the foundation. Then you need to bring up the other pillars to be successful, which we just discussed. I do not need to repeat it. And I think also when I now focus on Germany, I think there is a lot in the media right now saying, Germany is going down. I mean, if you open Handelsblatt or Spiegel or whatever, everything is going down. And you ask yourself, why are you building something in Germany? But I think the substance is so much better than what's in the media and what the people currently say, because there is very talented engineers, there's people who really want to change something. I think this is underestimated, how many people agree to the transition idea and the mission, but it's just not continuously kept up in the political strategies, but also industry strategies. And therefore, everything is there to build something out of this, but we need more chefs actually to get the ingredients better together and find the right recipe and to cook a great meal. And that is something what we lack, but the ingredients are incredibly strong.
All right, we've got a good batch of ingredients. Clare Grey, who's doing it right?
I think it's an impossible question because I started off by saying with the 3 models of the US, China, and Europe, and none of us in Europe want to live in a top-down society. It's just not going to work. And the US model using protectionism is also, do we want to go in that strategy? So I think ultimately Europe has to be the ones who are doing it right. And we have to make sure that we find ways that we actually do it. Because I don't think the other alternatives are going to work within our model. I mean, we have a population, we have young people here who are very much committed to the energy transition. And what we now need to do in Europe is we need to finance it so that the people who've come out of COVID, who've come out of suffering from poverty and low unemployment, they are brought along in the energy transition. We need to think about ways that we subsidize that section of the community. We need to get charging points, if we're talking about batteries and electric vehicles, into inner cities, put the subsidies in there. So it's not a very good answer, but I think we have to be the ones who are doing it right, because I'm not sure that Europe would accept any of the other models.
Simon?
So I would say, if starting on the European level, if you look at the Green Deal and the Fit for 55 package, take that to any place outside of Europe, and I think people would be amazed by the level of comprehensiveness, ambition, and consistency of this policy package. And also, in the end, how rational the political debate and the compromise finding has been on the European level. And I think this is a huge asset, which is light years away from some of the issues. I mean, think about carbon pricing on a federal level in the United States, right? So, and then compare that to the ETS that the emissions trading system that we currently have, with last time certificates will be handed out, is probably going to be around 2039. I mean, this is amazing. The thing is, implicitly, Europe kind of embarked on the biggest investment challenge that this continent has probably seen in decades, and didn't realize it really. And it's at odds with some of the foundational pillars of the European institutions and the way it sees its role in essentially facilitating the internal market rather than scaling investments in these technologies. And I think that's an area, if we get that nut cracked better, there will be a strong acceleration, and we still have quite of a head start. And then there are a number of examples. I know I live in Germany myself. I'm sick and tired of the level of the political debate that we currently have. I mean, the current government really is excellent at essentially portraying anything that they do in the worst possible way. And interestingly, they do it themselves, which is, you know, if you just experience it a bit, it can be remarkably, but if you have it for years, it gets a bit tiresome. But they did manage to clear a lot of the roadblocks. I mean, I recently had a discussion on storage. A lot of the standard roadblocks of storage have been cleared in Germany. A lot of the standard roadblocks for wind power have been cleared in Germany. A lot of the standard roadblocks for transmission have been cleared in Germany. There have been huge steps that will become apparent in the coming years when we look at deployment. But still, on the EU level, wonderful policy framework, but we need to solve this investment thing.
You know, we talked a little bit if there's going to be, before today's panel, I wrote, is it going to be a bad news panel or a good news panel? And it sounds, actually, there is some good news, which is really, really fantastic. And now, audience, who has a question for my esteemed panel? Anyone in the audience? Yes, we have someone here. Please stand up, say your name, where you're from, and your question.
Sure. Hi, Sylvia Wico. I'm with the FAU Erlangen-Nürnberg. And my question for the panel is, we've talked a lot about sort of the physical aspects of interdependency, but I'm wondering more also about the digital aspects, given what we've been talking about in the previous panels, because the energy transition also requires digitalization, right? You need to somehow match supply and demand. And the way that's done right now is usually using cloud services, if it's done at all. And cloud services are provided by big tech. So what would a digitally autonomous energy transformation actually look like?
That's a big question. Yeah, please, Simon.
I think that's a point that will become much more apparent and in the focus in the coming years, the first time that we will see a kind of digitally induced blackout. And I personally am wondering why we haven't seen that already. I mean, you have literally dozens of gigawatts in European networks of solar PV capacity that are linked to Wi-Fi's that you could, you know, hack and collectively take out. In the end, what it will probably require is a different system architecture, in the sense that you would have cellular networks, which might even be regulated not to all use the same algorithms, and that it's structurally embedded in the system that you can't take it down all at once. Or if a certain coordination layer fails, you have different layers that can step in. Yeah, the problem is that's quite far away from the control logic that we currently have, so that would be a big piece of work. And I don't know how we will get there, but I think ultimately we will end up there. But in the current setup, it's a question of when, not if, something will go wrong, I'm afraid.
Thanks so much. Also for the question we didn't get a chance to even touch on. Yes, please.
Yeah, maybe
yes.
one addition to this, because we talked about the energy ecosystems as well. And I think what you need to do first, also sequencing again, is to look at decentral ecosystems, like big consumption, generation, to understand like maybe like a factory, like the generation in terms of wind and PV, and then you have a storage, and understand what is the flows when the sun is shining, the wind is blowing, or when both is not there, and then understanding in the small, creating the data to understand what can you do to bring it to a national level and to a European level. And I think that is something what I think we also try to do in Heide, to embed big manufacturing in big manufacturing of energy, where you also have storage, to understand in terms of data what this is kind of all about, and then you can scale it in a certain way. I'm definitely not a data scientist, but actually that is important to create use case to understand how these systems work together.
Thanks so much, Nicolas.
Just a quick comment that, of course, data requires so much energy, so it's a total vicious circle. And so, you know, there are companies even thinking about building small nuclear reactors to support data storage. So it all comes around.
It's really fantastic to hear murmuring from the audience. I think it's great. I promised you that we were going to end on time, which means I'd love everyone here in the audience to give a great big round of applause to Clare Grey, Simon Müller, Nicolas Steinbacher. Thank you so much.